The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him.
Have you guys ever been in a situation where you're like, yeah, that's not the way that's supposed to happen? Like someone is trying to do something, you're like, okay, you don't do it that way. I think of these videos, right, of people working out that I'm like, that is not the way you use that gym equipment. Check it out. People sometimes don't seem to understand how things are supposed to work, how it is supposed to be. And sometimes we don't understand it either. Maybe it's been a bit more serious. Your sports season is canceled because of COVID. And you don't understand that's not the way life is supposed to be. You get your heart broken by someone who promised to never hurt you. And you don't understand. That's not the way life is supposed to be. Your mom or dad left and you don't understand. That's not the way life is supposed to be. For me, the moment that hits my heart so bad that I screamed at God, this is not the way life is supposed to be, was in February of 2020, when a former student of mine died at 17 from an accidental drug overdose. God, that's not supposed to happen. Teenagers are not supposed to die. We're not supposed to have to deal with this loss and pain and brokenness and anger and hurt. It's confusing. I don't understand. That's not the way life is supposed to be. And there's no way, God, that this can be part of what you have planned for us in this world. Because God, if you are good, this is not. Each of us can identify moments where we see this play out in our life. This is not the way life is supposed to be. And so we question, God, if you are good, this is not. So then, what? If this is not the way life is supposed to be because God is good and yet life is painful and we experience suffering, what is the way life works? What's the purpose to our pain and suffering if we choose to follow a God that claims to be good? This is a question that all of humanity struggles to put an answer to. It's a question that leads tons of people stuck to the point they never choose to put their faith into Jesus. They never move forward with what life has for them because they're too caught up with the suffering and pain they see and experience. And I don't blame them. How can God be good and yet suffering be so evident and overwhelming? These ideas seem so contradicting. A good God cannot allow suffering for those that love him, right? But what if that understanding of God is wrong? That Jesus never promised us life without pain and suffering. And if you believe that following Jesus means everything in your life being Gucci, your faith won't survive, it won't last, it won't endure. Because suffering is not the way it's supposed to be. It was never God's plan or intention to create us to suffer, because he did create us to be able to choose, you see, or another term we like to use is that he gave us free will. We're not robots. We choose how to live. We make decisions. Now, when we look at the creation story in Genesis with Adam and Eve, Genesis 1:31 says, God saw all that he had made and it was very good. God created this world perfect. It was without sin. But then Adam and Eve would go on to sin in the Garden of Eden. They would choose to trust themselves instead of trusting God. Thus, suffering entering into the world. There was no suffering prior to sin. Earlier, you heard a reading from the book of Colossians. I'm going to reread that passage for you, but this time in the Message translation. So Paul is writing while in jail, explaining where he is, what he is experiencing and processing in his life. Verse 24. I want you to know how glad I am that it is me sitting here in this jail and not you. There's a lot of suffering to be entered into this world, the kind of suffering Christ takes on. I welcome the chance to take my share in the church's part of that suffering. When I became a servant in this church, I experienced the suffering as a sheer gift. God's way of helping me serve you, laying out the whole truth. Jesus experienced suffering while on earth, and so will you. Jesus was cast out by those in his religion. He was rejected. He was then arrested, beaten, put on the cross to suffer and die a gruesome and painful death. He experienced emotional and physical trauma while on earth. He did that, came to earth to experience suffering to make the world right with God, to make us right with God. So how can suffering be a gift, as Paul explained earlier? God says after Adam and Eve sinning that we humans now are knowing good and evil. We cannot know the good in this world without also knowing the evil. By experiencing pain and suffering, we can also then recognize when we experience joy and blessing. Without something being bad, how can I know what is good? It's a weird balance, right? And it still does not fully give us peace to the statement that suffering is a gift. Because man, when Johnny died last year, that never felt like in that moment, it was a gift. It was painful, it sucked, and I hope I never, ever have to experience that again. So when we experience our sufferings or our trials, our go-to question is always, why is this happening to me? Or why did this happen? And that's where we get stuck, right? Because I really don't think you will ever fully grasp the why in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the suffering. On the other end of the pain, we may be able to answer the why, but in it, when you're sitting in the midst of your suffering, the why rarely gets answered. So instead, we reshape the question to how will I respond? We don't get a choice in why this happened. We only get a choice in how we respond. Make sure you hear this though. Choosing how we respond does not mean ignoring the pain. Choosing how you respond is embracing the emotions you're experiencing. This is what we see when Jesus learns his friend Lazarus dies in John 11. Jesus embraced his emotions. He embraced his suffering in that moment, and Jesus wept. Suffering is what makes us us. Our times of pain and suffering are the times when we are able to grow the most, because it is the times when we experience and can connect with the suffering and pain Jesus experienced in his life. In seasons when I have experienced suffering, I also recognize now when I look back, I get the why of how it shaped me into a better person. I have an answer to the why did this happen. Suffering has taught me to forgive myself. I will never be a perfect pastor, friend, daughter, wife, or whatever title I'm wearing in that moment. I'm going to always mess up. There are times when suffering is caused by our own mistakes. We can own our mistakes and say, what can I learn from this so it doesn't happen again? But then we need to let it go. Move forward into forgiveness for ourselves, for how we can do better. We cannot burden ourselves into a hole of despair from the mistakes we have made. Because who you are is far greater than your worst mistake. Suffering teaches us to forgive ourselves. Suffering has forced me to allow people to love me. When I'm crying and sad and weepy, I do not want anyone around me. I want to be alone in my misery. But suffering teaches us to allow people to show up, to love us. It forces us out of the cave of despair and into the arms of those around us. By allowing someone into knowing you're hurt, you allow yourself to feel their love. We grow through what we go through every time. And you get to choose what direction you grow. Do you choose to go away from your community, from God? Or do you choose to grow closer to God? Closer to the people around you? This is not the way life is supposed to be when we experience pain and suffering. But what if we are made better by the hard things in our life because we are made more like Jesus? The suffering he experienced in the last days in his life was intense and hard, but Paul recognizes it's also a way we were able to connect with him. You see, suffering as a gift. Paul keeps writing in Colossians 26. This mystery has been kept in the dark for a long time, but now it's out in the open. God wanted everyone, not just Jews, to know this rich and glorious secret inside and out, regardless of their background, regardless of their religious standing. The mystery in a nutshell is just this: Christ is in you, so therefore you can look forward to sharing in God's glory. It's that simple. That is the substance of our message. We preach Christ. Suffering has made me learn to pray. Okay, I'm a pastor, I get it, I know how to pray. But learning how to pray through pain, through doubt, through anger, through grief, that's a whole new level of intimacy with Jesus. I think this is why in Psalm 23 that King David wrote, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Even in our seasons of deepest despair, we can intimately seek Jesus there because we know even in the darkest of valleys, Jesus meets us there. I believe when we say Christ is in you in the midst of suffering, it means not only are we sharing in the suffering alongside someone else, it means that this is how we are grown, shaped, made more like Jesus. That's why Paul says it's a gift. We are all striving to become more like Jesus in how we live. And when we suffer, when we get to become more like Jesus, that's why Paul says Christ is in you. So because Christ is in you, therefore, Paul says you can also look forward to sharing God's glory. Jesus never experienced this glory while on earth, and yet that glory from God is eternal. We will all experience suffering, but we also will all experience God's glory if we choose to put our faith and trust in Jesus. It's the glory written about in Revelation 21 from John as he prophesied this. "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the former things have passed away.' And the one seated on the throne said, 'Behold, I make all things new.'" When we believe that God will make all things new, that he will take away the pain and suffering, it's because we know earth is not the way life is supposed to be. Our faith in Jesus is what will allow us to experience the eternal glory of heaven. Suffering shapes us. I've learned to forgive and love and pray in different ways because of the suffering I have walked through in my life. What has suffering taught you? We know that we get to reshape the question from why is this happening to how will I respond? And at times, we will fail to respond in a way that is healthy, but we get a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance to always redirect our lives to point it back at Jesus. There are plenty of times I look at my friends' little babies and I think to myself, I wish you didn't have to suffer in this world. I wish it was perfect and happy and that there was no more pain in this world. I wish that for you. But that's a selfish wish because without the suffering, without the pain, without the bad, we can never fully comprehend how God is good. Understanding that suffering is temporary, that it doesn't have the final word, doesn't cheapen the pain and hurt you're going through, but it does change our mindset. It allows for us to connect with Jesus on a more personal level because suffering is a gift. And yet, it's not the way it's supposed to be. And it's not the final word in our story. God's glory, meaning heaven, that's the end game. That's where we get to end up if we choose to put our faith and trust in Jesus. Kingdom mindset doesn't take away the pain. It allows us to step through it, into it, and grow with it, to demonstrate that Jesus is in you. We wake up every day with this new mindset. I'll be able to get through this suffering knowing I'm going to grow through it, knowing that suffering is not the way it's supposed to be, knowing that this season of suffering is shaping me, knowing the season of suffering is temporary, even when it doesn't feel that way. But most importantly, suffering allows for Christ to live in me. Thanks, CSM.